The autumn rain drummed against the restaurant windows with the kind of persistent rhythm that seemed to echo the hollow ache Oliver Matthews had carried in his chest for the past 18 months. He sat at table 14, fingers wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold, watching droplets race down the glass like tears he had stopped allowing himself to shed. The burgundy leather booth felt too spacious for one person, a constant reminder of the empty spaces that had become his unwelcome companions since Sarah's death. His sister Jennifer had been relentless in her campaign to get him here tonight. She had cornered him 3 weeks ago at their monthly family dinner, her voice taking on that particular tone of loving exasperation that meant she would not be deterred. She had spoken of moving forward, of Sarah wanting him to be happy, of how isolation was becoming his prison rather than his sanctuary. Oliver had finally agreed to the blind date, not out of any genuine desire for companionship, but simply to prove to himself and to Jennifer that he was not ready, that the wound was still too fresh, that no one could ever fill the space Sarah had occupied in his life. The hostess appeared at his table with a woman who seemed to move through the dimly lit restaurant like a ghost, stepping out of his most vivid memories. Oliver's breath caught in his throat as she approached, and for a moment the entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. The woman had Sarah's auburn hair, the same gentle wave that caught light in exactly the same way. Her eyes held the same deep green that had always reminded him of forest pools in early morning. The shape of her face, the delicate curve of her jawline, the way she carried herself with that particular blend of confidence and vulnerability. Everything about her was achingly, impossibly familiar. Kate Wilson extended her hand as the hostess retreated, and when Oliver rose to greet her, he found himself staring into a face that belonged to his dreams and nightmares in equal measure. Her smile faltered slightly as she took in his expression, a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or confusion, crossing her features. She had expected this moment, had known exactly what effect her appearance would have, but seeing the color drain from his face made her question whether she had made a terrible mistake. They settled into the booth with the awkward politeness of strangers, though the air between them crackled with an electricity neither could name. Kate ordered the same wine Sarah had always chosen, a detail that struck Oliver with such force he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. She spoke about her work as a pediatric nurse, her voice carrying the same gentle cadence he had fallen asleep to countless nights, and Oliver found himself nodding without really hearing the words. The conversation moved in careful circles around the truth that hung between them like a curtain neither dared to pull aside. Kate mentioned growing up in Portland, spoke of moving to Atlanta 2 years ago for work, described her small apartment in Virginia Highland with the kind of specific detail that suggested she was buying time. Oliver shared fragments of his life as a history professor at Emory, his research into Civil War battlefields, his love of weekend hiking trips through the Georgia mountains. But every word felt hollow when spoken to a face that belonged to his past. It was Kate who finally broke through the pretense, her voice barely above a whisper as she set down her wine glass and looked directly into his eyes. She told him she knew who he was, had known from the moment Jennifer had mentioned his name through a mutual friend who had arranged this meeting. She spoke of Sarah, of growing up as her twin sister, of the phone calls that had grown less frequent as Sarah built her life with Oliver, of the guilt she carried for not being closer when the cancer came. Oliver listened as Kate described the funeral she had watched from the back of the church, too overwhelmed by her own grief and guilt to approach him in his devastating loss. She spoke of the letters she had written but never sent, of the dozens of times she had driven past their house hoping to catch a glimpse of him, needing to know that someone else was carrying the weight of Sarah's absence. She confessed that she had orchestrated this meeting not through any dating app or mutual friend, but through careful manipulation of circumstances that had led Jennifer to believe she was setting him up with a stranger. The revelation should have angered him, but Oliver found himself feeling something closer to relief. The uncanny resemblance finally had an explanation that did not require him to question his sanity or believe in impossible coincidences. Kate was not a cruel trick of his imagination or some cosmic joke at his expense, but a real person with her own relationship to loss, her own need for understanding and closure. They left the restaurant without finishing their meals and walked through the rain-soaked streets of Midtown Atlanta, neither caring about getting wet. Kate led them to Piedmont Park, where she and Sarah had played as children during summer visits to their grandmother. Under the shelter of a large oak tree, she began to share memories Oliver had never heard. Stories from before he had entered Sarah's life, pieces of his wife's history that painted a fuller picture of the woman he had lost. Kate described Sarah's fear of thunderstorms that had persisted well into her 20s, a vulnerability Oliver had never witnessed because it had disappeared somewhere along the way. She spoke of Sarah's secret dream of learning to paint watercolors, a passion she had mentioned only once in passing during their marriage. These glimpses into his wife's inner world felt like unexpected gifts, treasures he had not known existed. In return, Oliver found himself sharing aspects of Sarah that Kate had never known. He spoke of his wife's habit of singing off-key in the shower every morning, of her tendency to leave half-finished crossword puzzles scattered throughout their house, of the way she had insisted on making elaborate Halloween costumes for neighborhood children despite having none of her own. He described her final months not as a series of medical appointments and declining health, but as a time when her essential kindness had somehow grown even brighter, when her laughter had become more precious because they both knew how finite it was. They discovered that they had both been living with incomplete versions of the same person, each holding pieces of Sarah that the other desperately needed. Oliver had known Sarah, the wife, the partner, the woman who had shared his bed and his dreams for the future. Kate had known Sarah, the sister, the child, the girl who had whispered secrets in the dark and made promises about growing old together. The weeks that followed their first meeting fell into a pattern that felt both natural and strange. Kate would call Oliver on Thursday evenings, always with some small excuse about a book Sarah had mentioned or a recipe she thought he might enjoy. These conversations stretched longer each time, evolving from tentative exchanges about their shared loss into something deeper and more complex. Oliver found himself looking forward to Kate's calls with an intensity that troubled him. She was not Sarah, despite the physical resemblance that continued to catch him off guard at unexpected moments. Kate was quicker to laugh, more prone to sudden decisions, more likely to speak her thoughts without the careful consideration that had been Sarah's way. Yet these differences, rather than creating distance, seemed to make their connection feel more real, rather than less. They began meeting for coffee on Saturday mornings at a small cafe in Grant Park, far enough from Oliver's usual haunts that he did not have to worry about concerned friends interpreting these encounters as evidence of his readiness to move on. Kate would arrive precisely on time, carrying books that Sarah would have loved, wearing scarves in colors that brought out the green in her eyes exactly the way Sarah's had. During these meetings, they developed a ritual of sharing one memory of Sarah from the past week, moments that had surfaced in their daily lives like photographs floating to the surface of still water. Oliver might describe finding one of Sarah's bookmarks in a novel he had finally brought himself to open, while Kate would share a dream in which she and Sarah were children again, building elaborate sandcastles that the tide inevitably swept away. These exchanges gradually expanded to include their own experiences, their struggles with grief, their attempts to rebuild meaning in lives that had been fundamentally altered by loss. Oliver spoke of his inability to enter the bedroom he had shared with Sarah, of sleeping on the living room couch for 18 months because their bed felt like a monument to everything he had failed to protect. Kate described her decision to move to Atlanta as a form of penance, an attempt to be closer to the life Sarah had built, even though she was no longer in it. One November afternoon, as they walked through the Atlanta Botanical Garden among the last of the autumn colors, Kate stopped beside a bench overlooking the rose garden, where Oliver and Sarah had been married 3 years earlier. She had not known this detail, had chosen the location randomly, but the recognition in Oliver's face told her immediately that they had stumbled into sacred ground. Kate suggested they sit, and in the fading afternoon light, Oliver found himself describing his wedding day not as a joyous celebration, but as the moment when he had fully understood the responsibility of loving someone completely. He spoke of the vows he and Sarah had written separately, but discovered were almost identical, promises about weather and seasons, about holding space for each other's growth and change, about recognizing that love was both a feeling and a choice that required daily renewal. Kate listened without interruption, understanding that Oliver was not simply sharing memories, but entrusting her with the sacred geography of his relationship with her sister. When he finished speaking, she placed her hand over his in a gesture that was both completely natural and entirely unprecedented in their careful friendship. The physical contact sparked something neither had anticipated, a recognition that their connection had evolved beyond shared grief into something that belonged entirely to them. Yet this realization brought with it a tangle of complicated emotions, guilt and loyalty, and the question of whether caring for Kate somehow diminished his love for Sarah or honored it in ways he could not yet understand. Winter descended on Atlanta with unusual severity that year, and Oliver found himself inviting Kate to his house for the first time on a particularly cold December evening. She had been fighting a stubborn cold, and he had impulsively suggested she come over for the homemade chicken soup he had learned to make from Sarah's grandmother's recipe. Kate arrived carrying a bottle of wine and wearing one of Sarah's scarves, a detail that struck Oliver with surprising gentleness, rather than the sharp pain such resemblances had once caused. She moved through his house with the easy familiarity of someone who had heard detailed descriptions of every room, noting the photographs he had turned face down, the closed doors that marked territories still too painful to enter. They ate dinner in the kitchen, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a life interrupted. Sarah's coffee mug still occupied the cabinet shelves. Her handwriting still marked the family calendar that Oliver had not been able to bring himself to update. Her reading glasses still rested on the counter beside a stack of mail that had arrived after her death. Kate did not comment on these shrines to the past, understanding that grief had its own timeline that could not be rushed or rationalized. Instead, she helped Oliver wash dishes and listened as he explained his research into Sherman's march to the sea, allowing the conversation to flow toward neutral ground, where they could simply be two people sharing an evening without the weight of history pressing between them. When Kate mentioned that she was considering taking a position at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, a job that would require a longer commitment to the city, Oliver found himself encouraging her decision with an enthusiasm that surprised him. The prospect of her leaving Atlanta created a hollow feeling in his chest that had nothing to do with Sarah and everything to do with Kate herself, with the way her laughter filled spaces in his life he had not realized were empty. That night, as Kate prepared to leave, she hesitated at the front door and asked if she could see a photograph of Sarah from before they had met. Oliver led her to the living room and showed her a picture from Sarah's college graduation, an image of his wife at 22, Beaming with pride and possibility, her whole life stretched out before her like an unwritten story. Kate studied the photograph with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She told Oliver that Sarah looked exactly as she had always imagined her sister would look when she grew up, fulfilled and loved and completely herself. The moment stretched between them with the weight of recognition, the understanding that they were not just two people bound together by shared loss, but two individuals who had found in each other something unexpected and entirely their own. When Kate reached up to touch Oliver's face, tracing the line of his jaw with fingertips that trembled slightly, he did not pull away, but leaned into the contact with a hunger that had nothing to do with physical resemblance and everything to do with the deep human need for connection and understanding. They did not kiss that night, both recognizing that such a step would require careful consideration of what it might mean and what they were prepared to risk. Instead, Kate left with the promise to call the next day, and Oliver stood in his doorway, watching her tail lights disappear into the December darkness, feeling more present in his own life than he had in almost 2 years. The holidays passed quietly, with Kate joining Oliver for Christmas dinner at Jennifer's house, where she was welcomed with the warm enthusiasm his family had always shown to important people in his life. No one commented on the obvious physical resemblance to Sarah, understanding instinctively that Kate was not a replacement but a person in her own right, who had earned her place at their table through her own kindness and her genuine care for Oliver's well-being. Jennifer later confided to Oliver that she had known about Kate's true identity from the beginning, had orchestrated their meeting precisely because she believed Kate might understand his grief in ways that a stranger could not. She had watched her brother disappear into his loss for 18 months and had been willing to take the risk of re-traumatizing him if it meant pulling him back into the world of the living. Oliver should have felt manipulated by this revelation, but instead, he found himself grateful for his sister's intervention, for her recognition that healing sometimes required unconventional approaches, and that love could take forms that defied easy categorization. As winter gave way to spring, Oliver and Kate's relationship continued to deepen in ways that felt both inevitable and miraculous. They took weekend trips to Savannah and Charleston, exploring historic districts and walking along riverfront paths where they could talk for hours without interruption. These excursions allowed them to exist outside the shadow of Atlanta, to be simply Oliver and Kate, rather than the widower and the twin sister, navigating the complex geography of shared loss. During these trips, they developed inside jokes and private rituals that belonged exclusively to them. Kate had a habit of collecting unusual postcards from antique shops, while Oliver photographed architectural details that caught his eye. They would share these discoveries over dinner, building a catalogue of experiences that had nothing to do with Sarah, yet somehow honored her memory by demonstrating that love and joy were still possible after devastating loss. One evening in late March, as they sat on the porch of a bed and breakfast in Madison, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance among the azalea bushes, Kate told Oliver about the years she had spent feeling guilty for being the twin who lived while Sarah suffered and died. She described the irrational but persistent belief that she should have somehow taken on her sister's illness, that her health was a betrayal of their shared DNA and childhood promises to face everything together. Oliver listened as Kate spoke of the survivor's guilt that had driven her to become a pediatric nurse, choosing a profession that allowed her to care for children facing their own battles with illness and injury. She had found purpose in helping families navigate the medical system that had ultimately failed Sarah, using her experience as a patient advocate to ensure that other families received the support and information that had seemed so elusive during her sister's final months. The conversation led naturally to Oliver's own struggles with guilt. His persistent questions about whether he had pushed Sarah hard enough to seek treatment sooner, whether he had been too optimistic about experimental therapies, whether his love had somehow been insufficient to sustain her through the worst of her suffering. These were thoughts he had never shared with his therapist or his family, doubts that had eaten at him during the long, sleepless nights when grief felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. Kate reached for his hand as he spoke, her touch grounding him in the present moment, rather than the endless loop of self-recrimination that had become his mental default. She reminded him that love was not a medical treatment, that caring deeply for someone did not grant the power to alter the fundamental unfairness of cancer or guarantee outcomes that defied statistical probability. They sat in comfortable silence as night fell around them, listening to the sound of wind moving through the old oak trees and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. When Kate suggested they go inside, Oliver found himself hoping she would stay in his room rather than retreating to her own, not out of physical desire, but from a deep need to not be alone with his thoughts in an unfamiliar place. Kate seemed to understand his unspoken request, settling beside him on the antique quilt that covered the bed and allowing him to talk until exhaustion finally claimed him. She watched him sleep for a while, noting the way his face relaxed in unconsciousness, the way his breathing settled into the deep rhythm of genuine rest, rather than the fitful dozing that had characterized his nights since Sarah's death. When Oliver woke the next morning to find Kate already dressed and reading by the window, he felt a profound gratitude that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with the simple human kindness of not being abandoned in vulnerable moments. They had crossed some invisible threshold during the night, establishing a level of trust that would form the foundation for whatever their relationship might become. The drive back to Atlanta passed in contemplative quiet, both of them processing the implications of their growing closeness and the questions it raised about loyalty, timing, and the nature of love after loss. Oliver found himself wondering whether Sarah would approve of his feelings for Kate, whether she would see this development as a betrayal of their marriage or as evidence that he was finally beginning to heal. Kate seemed to be wrestling with similar questions, occasionally glancing at Oliver with an expression that suggested she was seeing him not as her sister's husband, but as a man she had come to care about independent of any family connection. This shift in perspective felt both liberating and terrifying, opening possibilities she had not allowed herself to consider, while also raising the specter of complications that could destroy the fragile peace they had built together. Back in Atlanta, they resumed their routine of regular contact and shared activities, but something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between them. There was a new awareness in the way Kate looked at Oliver, a recognition of attraction that she had been suppressing out of respect for his grief and her own complicated position in his life. Oliver noticed this change and found himself responding to it with a mixture of excitement and anxiety that reminded him of adolescent crushes rather than the mature love he had shared with Sarah. He caught himself paying closer attention to Kate's appearance, noticing the way sunlight brought out auburn highlights in her hair, or how her smile transformed her entire face in moments of genuine happiness. These observations made him feel simultaneously guilty and alive, as though he were betraying Sarah's memory while also honoring her wish that he find happiness after her death. Sarah had made him promise during her final weeks that he would not spend his life as a monument to their marriage, that he would remain open to love in whatever form it might take, but he had never imagined that form might involve someone who looked so much like her, yet was so fundamentally different. One April evening, as they walked through Grant Park after a particularly difficult day at the hospital for Kate, she finally spoke directly about the attraction that had been building between them for months. She told Oliver that she had fallen in love with him, not because he reminded her of the brother-in-law she had never really known, but because of his kindness, his intelligence, his capacity for deep feeling, and his determination to honor Sarah's memory while still remaining open to new experiences. Oliver stopped walking and looked at Kate with an expression of wonder and terror that made her heart race with anticipation and dread. He told her that he loved her too, that his feelings had grown slowly and without his permission, taking root in the spaces between grief and healing where he had least expected to find new life growing. The admission hung between them like a bridge they could choose to cross or leave untested, a recognition of possibility that carried both promise and risk in equal measure. They were standing on the threshold of something that could either honor their connection to Sarah or destroy the carefully constructed peace they had built around their shared loss. Kate suggested they take time to consider what this revelation might mean for their future, understanding that rushing into physical intimacy could complicate emotions that were already layered with complexity. Oliver agreed, recognizing that whatever they decided would need to be approached with the same careful consideration they had brought to every aspect of their relationship. The following weeks passed with a new tension underlying their interactions, the acknowledged attraction creating an electric current that made every casual touch feel significant and every shared glance carry weight. They continued their regular activities, but with a heightened awareness of each other that transformed even mundane moments into opportunities for connection. During this period of careful consideration, Oliver made the decision to visit Sarah's grave for the first time since the funeral, needing to process his feelings in the place where her physical presence felt most concentrated. Kate offered to accompany him, but he declined, understanding that this conversation needed to happen privately between him and his memories of his wife. The cemetery was peaceful on the late spring morning when Oliver finally made the journey to Sarah's resting place. He had avoided this pilgrimage for nearly 2 years, unable to reconcile the vibrant woman he had loved with the reality of her body buried beneath carefully tended grass and granite. Standing beside the headstone that bore Sarah's name and the dates that bracketed her too short life, Oliver found himself speaking aloud for the first time since her funeral. He told her about Kate, about the unexpected love that had grown from their shared grief, about his fears that caring for someone else somehow diminished the depth of his feelings for her. As Oliver spoke, he felt a gradual sense of release, as though Sarah herself were giving him permission to pursue happiness wherever he might find it. He remembered her voice during their final conversations, her insistence that his love for her should not become a prison that prevented him from experiencing the full richness of life. The realization that he could love Kate without betraying Sarah felt like a revelation, a recognition that the human heart had capacity for multiple forms of love that could coexist without diminishing each other. His marriage to Sarah had been complete and perfect in its own time, but that chapter of his life had ended with her death, leaving space for new stories to begin. When Oliver returned from the cemetery, he called Kate and asked her to meet him at the restaurant where they had first encountered each other 6 months earlier. She arrived to find him waiting at the same table where he had sat in stunned recognition, but his expression now carried hope rather than bewilderment. Oliver took Kate's hand across the table and told her about his visit to Sarah's grave, about the peace he had found in speaking honestly about his feelings, about his growing certainty that love was not a finite resource that required careful rationing, but an renewable energy that flourished when shared freely. Kate listened with tears in her eyes, understanding that Oliver was offering her not just his love, but his trust, his willingness to risk his heart again after devastating loss. She told him that she had spent her life believing she was destined to remain in Sarah's shadow, the less interesting twin who had never quite measured up to her sister's natural magnetism and effortless charm. Meeting Oliver and discovering that he could see her as a separate person rather than a replica had shown Kate that she had her own unique value, her own capacity to inspire love and devotion. She told Oliver that loving him had taught her to love herself, to recognize that she deserved happiness that was not dependent on her resemblance to someone else. Their first kiss happened naturally as they sat in the restaurant booth, a gentle exploration that felt both like a beginning and a homecoming. The physical connection carried none of the desperate hunger Oliver had feared, but rather a tenderness that acknowledged the journey they had traveled together and the courage it had taken to arrive at this moment. They left the restaurant hand in hand, walking through the Atlanta streets where they had first begun to know each other as individuals rather than simply as two people united by loss. The city around them buzzed with evening activity, but Oliver and Kate moved through it in their own private bubble of contentment, finally free to express openly the affection that had been building between them for months. That night, Kate stayed with Oliver in the house he had shared with Sarah, finally entering the bedroom he had avoided since his wife's death. Together, they opened windows that had been closed for 2 years, allowing fresh air to circulate through spaces that had become monuments to the past rather than rooms for living. They made love with the careful reverence of people who understood that physical intimacy was not just about pleasure, but about trust, vulnerability, and the courage to remain open to joy even after experiencing profound loss. Their connection felt both familiar and entirely new, rooted in genuine affection rather than grief or the need to recapture something that belonged to the past. In the months that followed, Oliver and Kate built a life together that honored both their individual histories and their shared future. Oliver began the process of sorting through Sarah's belongings, keeping items that held genuine sentimental value while donating clothes and books to organizations that could put them to good use. Kate helped with this process not as Sarah's sister trying to preserve every trace of her memory, but as Oliver's partner supporting him through the difficult work of choosing which pieces of the past to carry forward and which to release. They discovered that grief could coexist with happiness, that remembering Sarah with love did not require maintaining their home as a museum to her memory. Together, they planted a garden in the backyard where Sarah had always intended to grow vegetables, but had never found the time. The tomatoes and peppers they tended became symbols of continuity and renewal, proof that life could flourish in soil that had once seemed barren. Oliver returned to more active teaching and research, his renewed engagement with life translating into passionate lectures about historical resilience and the human capacity for rebuilding after devastation. His students noticed the change in his demeanor, the way his discussions of Civil War reconstruction carried personal weight that made abstract historical concepts feel immediate and relevant. Kate accepted the position at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, finding in her work a sense of purpose that complemented rather than competed with her growing relationship with Oliver. She specialized in helping families navigate the complex emotions of medical crisis, using her own experience with loss to provide comfort and practical guidance to parents facing their worst fears. Their life together fell into patterns that felt both comfortable and exciting, a blend of routine and spontaneity that allowed them to build stability while remaining open to new experiences. They took cooking classes together, learning to prepare meals that belonged to neither of their pasts, but created new traditions for their shared future. On weekends, they explored hiking trails throughout Georgia and the Carolinas, discovering that physical activity in natural settings provided the perfect environment for the kind of deep conversation that continued to strengthen their bond. These excursions became opportunities to dream about the future, to discuss their hopes for career advancement, travel, and the possibility of starting a family together. The question of children arose gradually and naturally between them, born not from pressure to replace what Oliver had lost with Sarah, but from a genuine desire to create new life together. Kate's work with pediatric patients had only strengthened her maternal instincts, while Oliver found himself imagining the joy of sharing his love of history and literature with a child who would carry both his genes and Kate's generous spirit. They approached the topic of marriage with the same careful consideration they had brought to every major decision in their relationship, understanding that such a commitment would need to be based on their genuine compatibility rather than any sense of obligation to Sarah's memory or pressure from well-meaning family members. When Oliver finally proposed to Kate on a warm September evening, as they sat on the porch of the house they now shared, he chose words that honored both their past experiences and their hopes for the future. He told her that he wanted to spend his life growing old with her, creating new memories while treasuring the ones that had brought them together. Kate accepted his proposal with tears of joy and the deep satisfaction of knowing that their love had been tested by time and circumstance, that they had chosen each other not out of convenience or desperation, but from genuine affection and shared values. Their wedding took place the following spring, in the same botanical garden where they had first acknowledged their attraction to each other, surrounded by friends and family who had watched their relationship develop from tentative friendship into deep and abiding love. Jennifer served as Kate's matron of honor, finally able to see her brother fully engaged with life again, his face glowing with the kind of happiness she had feared he might never experience after Sarah's death. During the ceremony, Oliver and Kate exchanged vows they had written together, promises that acknowledged the unique circumstances of their meeting while looking forward to a future built on their shared commitment to honesty, kindness, and mutual support. They spoke of love not as a feeling that happened to them, but as a choice they made each day, a decision to remain open to each other's growth and change. The reception celebrated not just their marriage, but the journey that had brought them to this moment, the unexpected paths that had led two grieving people to find healing in each other's company. Sarah's memory was honored not through elaborate tribute, but through the joy that filled Oliver's face as he danced with his new wife, evidence that love could indeed triumph over loss when approached with patience and genuine care. As Oliver and Kate began their married life together, they carried with them the wisdom that had emerged from their individual experiences of grief and recovery. They understood that happiness was not a destination, but a daily practice, that building a life together would require ongoing effort and communication, but also that love, freely given and gratefully received, could provide the foundation for a future neither had dared to imagine during their darkest moments. Their story became one of the quiet miracles that sometimes emerge from devastating loss, proof that the human heart's capacity for healing and renewal can surprise even those who have experienced its depths. Oliver and Kate had found each other not in spite of their connection to Sarah, but because of it, discovering that love could take forms that defied conventional understanding while remaining absolutely real and deeply satisfying.